Welcome to everyone. So thrilled that all of you are able to join us today on what I know is going to be a really exciting and interesting discussion about how behavioral economics and digital technologies can come together to improve care and outcomes. So to introduce myself, I'm John Breen. I'm the Executive Director of Health Strategy for a group called the Q Collective. We're a curated group of companies designed to understand, connect, and explore the edges of what our societies need now and what they'll need in the decades to come. BEworks, our hosts today, are one of our most exciting companies. I always say they're kind of our secret weapon in making real meaningful change across healthcare, and we'll talk about that a bit today. So to get into the topic, investment, use, and adoption of digital technologies across healthcare is accelerating. But the big question is, can we ride this momentum towards a new age in patient care, or are these innovations destined to languish a bit? One challenge I think we all know already is that when it comes to technological innovation, people often do not use technology the way it's intended, or rather, sometimes technology is not always designed to maximize behavior change. So today, what we want to do in this session is to hear from leading behavioral scientists and health experts who will explore the intersections between technology, innovation, and behavioral economics with a goal of improving overall health outcomes. And we'll also look to unlock what really needs to happen to ensure that the investments we make in digital health technology actually drive the changes they promise. Again, to me, I get excited about this because I think the application of behavioral science is one of the keys to moving our health system forward from a focus on sickness to a focus on overall well-being, and for scaling healthy behaviors for individuals, communities, and populations. So I don't want to take too much time, but I do want to introduce our speakers and panelists for today's session. So first, Kelly Peters, CEO and co-founder of BEworks. Just a bit of background on BEworks. So the world's leading behavioral change firm dedicated to helping global leaders unlock growth and stakeholder value by applying cutting-edge insights from behavioral economics, data, and rigorous scientific methods. Kelly is passionate about bringing scientific thinking to business strategy, marketing, and operations. She's a faculty lecturer of applied behavioral science at University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, and regularly lectures at a number of other academic centers. She's given numerous TED Talks, a sought-after keynote speaker, and has been featured in the New York Times and Forbes. Dr. Ada Lee, who's a vice president at BEworks, holds a PhD in cognitive neuroscience from the University of Toronto and was previously a postdoctoral research fellow at York University. She supports Fortune 1000 companies on innovation and communication strategies to produce long-lasting behavior change. You all know me already, so we can push forward to our panelists who you'll hear from in the second half of this. First off, Professor Dan Ariely, another co-founder and chief behavioral scientist from BEworks. He is a professor of behavioral economics at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. His writing on irrational decision-making in the marketplace has been featured in the most prominent academic journals and is in a variety of popular media outlets, such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and Boston Globe, among many others. He's written 3 New York Times best-selling books that have become recognized standards in the field: Predictably Irrational, The Upside of Irrationality, and The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. Dr. Julie O'Brien joins us. She's the Director of Applied Behavioral Science at Weight Watchers. She's been working at the intersection of health and technology at Weight Watchers, spending her career designing and testing scalable solutions that close the gap between what people want to do and what they actually do. She recently joined Weight Watchers, where she's building an applied behavioral sciences team to support product design and research. So again, looking forward to hearing from Julie. And then finally, last but not least, Dr. Rina Pandey, who's the Chief Medical Officer at Able2. Rina serves as a passionate voice for the need to bridge the gaps between mental health and behavioral health. She spearheads Able2's data analytics and outcomes research. And prior to her work at Able2, Dr. Pandey was a cardiologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston and an instructor at Harvard Medical School. So as I say, we have a tremendous panel. I'm humbled by the level of expertise that we have in this session. So just to give you a sense of our agenda for today and how this is going to work. Kelly's going to kick it off and talk a little bit about the promise and dangers of digitalization and kind of kick off the topic. From there, we're going to hear from Ada, who is going to talk a bit about the application of behavioral economics to the digitalization of care and some lessons learned. And then the latter part, the kind of the second half of the discussion, it's going to be an open panel discussion where we will hear from Dan, Rina, and Julie on their thoughts on the future behavioral sciences and how it can impact the digitalization of health. So that's enough from me. I'm going to throw it over to Kelly to dive into some of the content.
Thanks so much, John. Well, what I'd like to know is, have any of you ever had your Fitbit run out of battery? And then you're like, well, if I go do my steps now, it's not going to count. So why bother? A friend of mine joked that when her battery died, she was like, well, without being on the grid right now, I don't even exist. So instead of going for a walk, I'm going to go have wine. This is an example of the backfiring of wearable devices. So hello, and thank you all so much for joining me and my colleagues today. I'm absolutely delighted to be a part of the effort to bring this event to you and to share the experiences from work with my behavioral science team at BEworks and the important insights of our guests today. Our behavioral choices, including poor diets, inconsistent sleep, and physical inactivity, are amongst the leading causes of premature death and reduced quality of life. These choices lead to increases in the risk of developing chronic health conditions, such as cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, hormonal dysfunction, stress, mood disorders, and the consequences go on. Further efforts are needed to assist people to adopt healthier lifestyles. And digital apps and wearable activity trackers offer promise for us. Fortune magazine Business Insights reports that the global market size for the fitness tracker market was $36 billion in the year 2020, and they're expecting it to quadruple by 2028. However, the overall improvements to health have not been trending in the same positive direction. Over the past few years, my team at BEworks has worked on a number of projects with clients trying to figure out why their digital products and services aren't performing nearly as well as one might expect. Many of these services are designed in a way that is explicitly geared towards improving consumer and patient welfare and outcomes, and yet the impact isn't always what our clients want it to be. So first of all, we need to recognize and celebrate the fact that for most of us, data collection is a good step. Having data on hand is much better than relying on our selective memory that hangs on to salient events and, well, perceives them as a trend. That single long walk that we did last week becomes a faulty memory of a pattern of good exercise. However, while wearing a device can be helpful in motivating people to exercise and make lifestyle modifications, the challenge is that about half of us quit 6 months in. That includes those who joined gyms, those who bought wearables, compared to those who did both, joined gyms and purchased wearables. Here's the thing. Few wearables and their accompanying apps have been designed with behavioral insights in mind. Often when what they do is give us the raw metrics, step count, heart rate, and then it falls on us to interpret the data and determine if our activity is sufficient for optimal health. Instead of teaching people about statistics, though, we need behaviorally informed approaches to helpfully position data along with feedback so that we can stay motivated to achieve our goals. We need carefully considered changes to the choice architecture, such as strategies like anticipated regret, implementation intentions, goal setting, upfront lump sum loss aversion, and other nudges and boosts. And Julie from WW and Rena from Able2 are going to get into their application of behavioral insights to drive behavioral change. And while gathering data is useful, knowing what data means is better. What it means for diagnostics and what it means for action. As in, okay, so I have this data, but what's it telling me? And it turns out we aren't so great at interpreting what data means, and we aren't good at determining the correct course of action. Why? Because there's many psychological biases and barriers at play. For instance, A key measure that people rely on for assessing their overall health is their weight. When we start to exercise and diet, as soon as we step on a scale, we expect to see a singular declining linear path in the data. But the human body is more complex. Our fitness progress doesn't move that way. You can still be on the path to increasing your overall health while there's tremendous variance or noise in the data. So feedback and interpretation then are important elements to behavior change, especially since most people don't have a good scientific understanding of counts like steps. More could be better, but this fails to take into account intensity. And finally, people don't have a good understanding of norms. What is right for someone else might not be right for you. So Dan's going to talk about the creative approach that he and the SHAPA team took with redesigning a weight scale with these behavioral insights in mind. So the benchmarks we set are important, but can be overly simplistic. For instance, why 10,000 steps? Well, it was an arbitrary number. It's got a limited scientific basis. It was designed by a clock company in the 1960s who designed a pedometer. They created this number as an approximation of the typical daily steps that we take to perform our routine activities like commuting and shopping, which is around 7,000 steps. And then they combined that with about 30 minutes of exercise, which resulted in about 10,000 steps. Here we are. A clock company's benchmark for good health is what led all of us to start marching 10,000 steps a day. But the reality is that this number is inadequate for some who are working towards a more active lifestyle. And it might actually be a higher, harder benchmark than it needs to be for others. It underreaches for some, leading to poorer outcomes, and overreaches for others. The simplicity of this benchmark runs the risk of reducing the very motivation it intends to create. A final point, steps alone are not as effective as steps with sufficient intensity. And many wearables just don't make allowance for these important nuances. But the revolution in data and tracking devices is advancing. We're moving from devices that track our steps and sleeps and moving into new arenas of health intervention. Longevity researcher Dr. Peter Attia makes the case for healthy individuals wearing a continuous glucose monitor. Conventional metrics may be inadequate for catching individuals that are developing or at risk of prediabetes. These individuals are on the precipice of disease, and it's important to catch them early. Here, the questions of interpretation become potentially even more consequential. Early detection provides an opportunity to apply behavior change in diet and physical activity to potentially prevent metabolic dysfunction. These monitors typically prompt patients to catalog their meals after a glucose spike is detected. They give wearers a daily and weekly metabolic score to help patients properly interpret the numbers. If a score is low, some apps suggest dietary and activity modifications and assess the impact of those behavioral changes. The continuous feedback and interpretation of data makes these monitors a useful tool for bringing blood glucose levels into an acceptable range, as well as reinforcing behavior change. These are positive steps, and Ada will get into more detail about the barriers to behavior change, and we'll share some of our scientific frameworks that we can employ to address them. Finally, the market for devices for everything is exploding and into many avenues, which are unregulated. Consumers are buying into gimmicks and they give false hope about cognitive performance, anxiety, and all kinds of health challenges. We need to be careful of these developments and calibrate our expectations about what these devices can do carefully. As healthcare practitioners, as product innovators, as policy designers, as behavioral architects, just as people who care about people, We need to recognize the complexities in motivation. If we want to see behavioral outcomes improve, we need to drive adoption of the tools, and we need to go further with understanding the user's experience of how they interpret data. We need to look at steps that ought to be taken to improve the perceived usefulness of data, and we need to address the barriers to adoption. And finally, we need aids to improve interpretation of the data and the calls to action. My colleagues in today's event will share some of their valuable insights to shed light on these important questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. So Kelly provided a lot of interesting insights on how we must tread carefully with the digitalization of healthcare. And one key point that's worth further emphasizing is that despite the potential perils of digitalization as it stands today, there are tangible actions that we can take to resolve those issues. Now, as behavioral scientists, of course, our stance is that resolving issues with digitalization start with the application of behavioral economics and behavioral insights to develop solutions that would overcome key challenges. So in this next section, we would like to show you how behavioral economics can be applied with some illustrative examples. But before we dive in, it's important to take a step back and note that the promise and the dangers of digitalization are pervasively relevant across all sectors of healthcare. So whether you are in pharmaceuticals, health insurance, digital health, or beyond, your organization is likely going through a digital transformation. In pharmaceuticals, you might be looking at the creation of digital technology to better support patient decision-making or physician training. In health insurance, you might be looking at supporting digital tools that help patients better adhere to their treatment plan, or even better, adhering to behaviors that would prevent disease. In digital health, you might be directly creating the technology with the goal of improving people's health and overall well-being. Now, the digital transformation that your sector is going through likely raises some burning questions. For example, how do you get people to use the technology? And just because the tech exists, this does not mean that people will use it. And if they do, it does not mean that they will use it correctly and consistently to achieve the health outcomes that they want. So how do we solve for that? So a traditional starting point to getting people to use the tech might include the following: giving people more information about the benefits of the tech, providing more information on how to use the output, or perhaps you may consider providing people with incentives to use the tech correctly and consistently. But time and time again, research has shown that information and incentives alone are not enough to change people's behaviors. Now, note that we're not saying that information and incentives do not work, but rather, we know that these approaches alone are usually not strong enough to produce large, long-lasting behavior change. We need something more. So in comes behavioral economics. Behavioral economics brings a different way to think about challenges. And the behavioral economics lens is this: we as humans do not operate as if we are robots. We are constrained by time, resources, and willpower. In other words, we are boundedly rational. We therefore rely on heuristics or mental shortcuts to make decisions. So for example, in the mornings, I automatically know to brush my teeth. I just do it. I do not have to weigh the pros and cons of doing so. It's simply the status quo. But these heuristics make us vulnerable to biases. I, for example, am vulnerable to the status quo bias. And these biases mean that our choices can be inconsistent with our needs, preferences, and interests. So my status quo to not exercise is inconsistent with my interest to achieve better long-term health for myself. But luckily, for people like myself who do want to change their behavior, our biases are large and systematic enough that we are predictably irrational. The status quo bias will always be a pervasive bias for me, and maybe for you too, but that's predictable. And since it is predictable, we can do something about it. So therefore, with expertise, we can tap into these irrationalities and nudge people to act according to their interest. And we can do so by changing the context in which they make their decisions. In other words, changing the choice architecture. Now, beyond recognizing that people have biases and that we can leverage these biases to help people achieve their health goals, behavioral economics also brings a different way to solve challenges. On the screen, you will see the 3 pillars of behavioral economics. The first pillar is research. The focus here is to diagnose the why. Why are people behaving in the way that they are or aren't? What biases and psychological barriers get in the way? Knowing these biases allows us to develop strategies and solutions. This is the second pillar. In the second pillar, the question that we want to answer is how. How do we overcome these barriers? What are the hypotheses and interventions that we can develop to change the choice architecture? Having those hypotheses and interventions in hand, we move into the third pillar, impact evaluation. Here, we can run randomized controlled experiments to test the hypotheses and to determine will it work? Does it work? And if so, by how much and why? So let's go through these pillars in a bit more detail. On research, the starting point is to identify the target behavior that you want to achieve. We need to first establish what is the overarching business goal. In our case today, it might be to increase digital tech usage. We then take this overarching goal and turn it into specific patient or physician behaviors that we can track and measure. Knowing what the target behaviors are allows us to ask the question, what's in the way of this target behavior? So let's see this through an example. For illustrative purposes, let's assume for a moment that you have an app that helps prevent kidney disease progression. It asks patients to log their daily food intake and whether they've gotten their dialysis treatments that day. The app might also log other relevant health data. So based on this information, the app tells the patient the status of their kidney function, good or bad. Using this information, the patient can then adjust their food plans and adhere better to doing their dialysis treatments. In this example, therefore, some of the key target behaviors we'd want patients to achieve might include the following: daily logging of their food and dialysis, doing a review once a week of their progress. Based on their progress, adjust their food plan and doing their dialysis treatments on time. But if your organization owns an app or tech like this, you will be all too familiar with the obstacles to getting patients to use such technology. People might start using the app, but then not log their data. If they log their data, they might get lost in the weeds with the details of the information that they're getting. Or they may be overwhelmed with the data and they avoid it altogether or ignore it. Worse, at some point, they might just abandon the tech. So what gets in the way of people using digital tech for their health? Years of cumulative expertise in behavioral science tells us that it's more than just the process journey. It's also about the psychological journey. That is to say that we need to do more than just map the steps that people take to achieve their target behaviors. We also need to develop an understanding of their psychological journey. Taking a closer look at the psychological journey allows us to examine the questions. Are they aware that the tech exists? Does it capture their attention? What do they perceive about this tech? Do they perceive it to be easy to use, accessible, of great value to their life? Can they trust it? Based on their perceptions, how do they evaluate this tech? Can they use it? Would they use it? Should they use it? This then gets funneled into a decision point. Can they produce an intention to act? And lastly, do they act? And can they maintain that behavior? Let's anchor this back to digital tech usage. What are some potential barriers? Let's assume for a moment that the patient is aware of the tech and of its benefits, features, how to use it, etc. Focusing in on the middle sections of the psychological journey, we know that on perception, the features that provide people with a peace of mind can also increase feelings of unfamiliarity. For instance, being able to track a lot of my health data can give me a peace of mind that this information is being stored somewhere and is being used somehow to improve my health. But having all this information can increase feelings of unease. What do I do with it? I'm not sure where to start. And this is because we know that people cannot intuitively interpret data and statistics. Even if the information is presented to them in a simple manner, people may not be able to translate these outcomes into a proper course of action. Lastly, features that entice people to adopt the technology can be the same features that prevent people from using it. This is because we tend to be overly optimistic with how useful certain features are for our future selves. At the outset, we're drawn to having lots of new, exciting functionalities, and we overestimate our future willingness and ability to use those features. So a question you might have now is, well, how do all these barriers relate to each other or interact? Now, their interaction can be summarized in the simplified tech adoption model. This is the simplified tech adoption model. So as we've already discussed, perceived ease of use on the left-hand side directly affects our perceived usefulness of the tech and the data. These factors, in turn, influence people's attitudes and intention to use the technology. Intention then trickles down into actual usage of the tech. Another factor that also influences people's intention can include, well, does the technology provide demonstrable results for me? Is the call to action effective? Zooming into the behavioral intention, into actual tech use part of the model, we also know that feature fatigue can be a key driver of a disconnect between people's intention to use versus actual use. That is, feature fatigue can create a say-do gap. Low self-efficacy is a key factor as well. Self-efficacy generally refers to a person's belief that they are able to succeed in accomplishing a task. So if it takes you forever to figure out how to use something, this could decrease your feelings of self-efficacy. So let's now come back up for some air. What does this all mean? We'd like to put forth 4 key hypotheses on how the dangers of digitalization can be resolved by providing people with careful guidance on how to use the data. First, reduce feature fatigue. Plainly, less is more. Provide the right level of data at the right times at the right frequency. By doing so, you will increase people's self-efficacy when they use your tech. Third, increase ease of use and actual usefulness. Pair the filtered data with heuristics or rules of thumb on how to interpret. Help people interpret the data and then simplify the interpretation. Lastly, help people create demonstrable results. Achieve this by linking the filtered data to specific calls to action. So with that, that is the end of my section. I now turn the mic to John, who will facilitate the panel discussion. In this panel, we will dig deeper into these hypotheses, discuss the panelists' point of view, and talk about the implications of these hypotheses in the real world and how they may be brought to life. So over to John.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Ada. And to my panelists, video and mics on, please. No, this is amazing. And, I think Kelly and Ada have really set the stage and given us a foundation of principles to think about and how to, what the barriers to behavior change are. And I love the hypotheses on how to start moving us there. So now, as Ada alluded to, what are some real world examples of success or how this has happened? And we can get right into it, actually. So Julie, first question for you is, if you could talk a little bit about how WW is applying behavioral sciences today to drive healthy actions among its members. And also, I was so intrigued when we spoke about how you brought together kind of behavioral scientists and design or designers to fuel better outcomes. So if you could just talk a little bit about your efforts at WW, that would be a great way to kind of kick us off.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of 2 ways that we think about it. So one is in terms of our core product, and making sure that our program actually helps people build habits in terms of, fluency and not overthinking things. And then the second piece is sort of like, how do you then design the experience to really reinforce those habits in a long-term way so that it's not just like a one-off set it and forget it, but like a continuous interaction that kind of evolves with the user, over time.
Amazing, great. Something, Rena, we talked a little bit about, you're obviously able to is at the forefront of kind of reshaping mental health and well-being. I'd be so curious, what are some of the opportunities or challenges you anticipate in virtual mental health and well-being moving forward?
Yeah, it's such a great question, John. For those of folks that are listening in that don't know what we do at Able2, we're a virtual provider of mental health care. And we've been at it for about 10 years when people weren't even thinking about telehealth and certainly weren't applying telehealth to mental health and trying to get patients to change their behavior and focused really at the outset on those individuals who had coexistent physical health conditions. You heard from John that I'm a cardiologist. You might be scratching your heads as to what got me over to mental health, but found it really difficult to help my patients change behavior in the clinical setting, and really came to understand to the degree to which mental health barriers were really in the way, and without addressing depression or anxiety head on, it was really challenging for me as a clinician to really help my patients adhere to their meds, quit smoking, exercise, eat right, whatever it may be. And that's the kind of work we do now much more broadly. But John, you're asking about what opportunities and what challenges still exist in our space. The opportunity, just to start there, what's wonderful is that mental health is getting an intense focus these days. And short of mental health, emotional health and emotional well-being. It preceded COVID with a lot of celebrities and actors and actresses and many others increasing awareness about mental health. COVID shed further light on the impact that mental health was no doubt going to have. So it's been great. But that explosion of interest has led to a lot of confusion in the space. So I feel like we need to apply behavioral economics to buyers and decision makers and how they think about which solutions to select. I think the challenge that remains, though, is while the focus has been on access and getting people to start to utilize tools, I think there has to continue to be a focus on quality and proof and outcomes. So I think there's still a ton of opportunity to improve virtual mental health care in those regards. I could wax philosophical for a long time, so I'll pause there, but happy to dig in on any of that.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's such an important topic and it could warrant its own discussion in itself. But and we'll come back to some of that for sure. But just to move us along a little bit, Dan, if you could tell us a little bit about SHAPA and specifically kind of your journey with the company and how it works and how it's been successful.
So SHAPA, and I'll give you the quick view, is a scale with no display. And the reason we did this is that we discovered through experiments that the scale is actually a source of much evil. And for two main reasons. One is what we call gain aversion. Weight fluctuates, goes up and down, up and down. And it turns out that the ups are more painful than the downs are happy. So imagine that you just have up and down, randomly, depending on how much salt you had and when you went to the bathroom and so on. The overall experience would be negative because the ups will be very painful, the downs will be slightly happy, so the overall experience will be negative. Now, and the second thing is that weight takes some time to change, as Kelly mentioned earlier. People start a diet and 2 days later they step on the scale and they say, I've been on a diet for 2 days. Where are my results? And the results take a long time. Actually, I'll give credit to Julie here. Julie did research showing that this is true for lots of things. Lots of medications, people expect the body to react very quickly. I think we have like a physical metaphor of the body. Medication in, improvement. But the fact that the body takes some time is a real mystery. And that creates confusion and lack of motivation. Imagine that somebody is on a diet for 3 days. They step up on the scale and it goes up by 0.5 pound. Then they take a day of break and they eat cheesecake. Now the scale goes down a little bit. How are you expecting people to learn? So that's the first part. The second part, which was also really interesting, is that we realized that we have to celebrate nothing bad happens. Naturally, nothing bad happens is not something to celebrate. Like we take it as, nothing good happened. But the reality, it's great. So imagine a year when somebody loses weight 5 weeks and nothing happens for the rest of the year. That's a fantastic year. But unless people categorize nothing bad happened as good news, they will feel that they've failed most of the year. Imagine you lost weight 15 weeks and the rest. Basically, we need to realize that most of the news is nothing happened. That's news, but that's great. So we create the scale with no display. People step on it. It's not frightening. And then we give people feedback in going up a lot, up a little, nothing happened, congratulations, green light, confetti, going down a little bit, going down a lot. And the results are very encouraging. We show that when people get a regular scale with decimals and so on, they gain 0.3% of their body weight every month for 6 months. This was a study in a call center, relatively low income, relatively obese. People who get our scale, no numbers, trends, celebrating nothing but happen, lose 0.6% of their body weight every month. Lose. And if we connect this, so I'm very proud of this scale because it uses lots of principles from social science. But if you think about this as a principle, I think there are kind of two general things to think about. One is we want to be present in people's lives. The reason we want to be a scale is we want it to be a reminder in people's lives. If I'm an app on page 3 of your phone, nobody thinks about me. If you have pictures of your kids somewhere in your photo album, you don't think about them that often. You print a picture, you put it on your desk, you'll think about the kids more. You have a scale in your bathroom, you'll think about health more. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I think we need a theory of information as causing behavioral change and not just information. So a lot of time what we do is we give people information at the same granularity we measure it. We measure something, we show people. And in fact, what we're doing in some ways, hiding information. But the reality is that it's really hard to figure out where you are and if things are moving in a random way and they have a pattern and you have somehow to statistically infer that. So I think we need to understand that our goal, like data can be accurate, can motivate behavior, and it can help people understand the relationship between cause and effect. But often you can't have all three and you have to choose. And I don't care so much about accuracy. It's not nice to say, but I care about behavioral change. Accuracy could be very nice, but if it's in contradiction with motivation, I prefer the motivation. Or think about something else. Think about A1C. When people fight diabetes, it's a losing battle. I mean, maybe you can get some improvement from time, but generally over life, it's going to get worse. Should we tell people, you know what, congratulations, you're deteriorating slightly slower than the average? How exciting is that? Not so much. Maybe we should change what we consider as zero. If we started thinking about measurement as a source for motivation, I think we would do lots of things differently. So presence, being part of people's lives, and motivation are the two big pillars, I think.
Excellent. So much to unpack there. I mean, I think the celebrating that nothing bad happens, it's such a counterintuitive concept. And this idea of like not having that instant gratification is something we all need to really, really think about in managing chronic disease as well as other applications across healthcare. And some of these principles, Dan, you bring it to life, some really clear lessons there in the SHAPA experience and beyond. So thank you for that. A question actually for Julie, it's related to what Dan was talking about, is your perspective on how we consume information. Where are current systems failing, and are there, or what's your perspective on areas to potentially improve some of that, kind of building upon some of the things Dan was talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's certainly a common belief that if we just give people information, they will make the rational choice and know what to do with it. I think, information is obviously important for experts, and we can sort of use the information and then transform it in a way that can be more helpful for the end user. But I think that it's sort of our job as solution designers to figure out how we do that in a way that sort of makes it actionable and targets it at the right moment in time.
Rena or Dan, anything to build on? And I should have teed this up in the beginning that feel free to kind of jump in and plus one on everybody's comments. But I'd be curious if you have anything to add on top of that.
If I think about the whole perspective of social science on health, I think the first part is just recognition of how difficult it is. It's really, forget the solutions for a second. It's just recognition of what it is. It's taking the perspective of somebody that has cookies next to them, and that person now has to make the right decision many times a day because there are many cookies and they're not going to go away for a while, and somebody has to make these choices. People have to stand up, and we build our environment to minimize effort. You look, I'm here, this kitchen that I'm looking at was designed to minimize the number of steps that are being taken. There's so much that we do to eat more quickly and more calories and not move as much and so on. And the world is designed in a way that is not supportive for us. So that's perspective one. Just understand how difficult it is. And then the second part is the solution creation. And of course, in the solution creation, there are many possible ways. There's not going to be one way that fits everybody. There's going to be lots of different approaches that depend on where people are, what the environment affords, and so on. But we need to design those. We have to change the environment to people. And the last comment I want to make, and this also comes back from research Julie did when the good old days when she was still in my lab. Julie looked at diabetes patients, and she looked at the question of what predicts their ability to control their A1C. And it turns out it wasn't if they understood diabetes, and it wasn't about their motivation. It wasn't about them understanding how to measure or being afraid of side effects. It had to do with what we call breakpoints. And breakpoint is the point in life where you're just fed up and you want some happiness. And in these points, when you're fed up and you want some happiness, what's the easiest, cheapest way to get some happiness? Unhealthy food. And the cycle of diabetes is really the cycle of reaching this breakpoint, being fed up with life, not thinking long-term, thinking short-term. Now, the thing that this struck me, and it took me a while to figure it out, maybe it's trivial, but it took me a while, is that a lot of time we think about the average. We think about the daily basis. How do people behave normally? But in many things in health, it's about the extreme events. You could be really good 6 days a week and mess up on one, and that's enough to more than make up for all the improvements. So we often think our perspective is usually to think about the average. Even in driving, are you a good average driver? It's not about the average. It's about the outlines. It's about the extreme events. I don't know how we got to start thinking more about the middle, but I think we need to think about extreme events, and especially in health. I think we need to shift our perspective to, people know what's the regular thing to do. The question is, how do we help people in those extreme events? And this is the place where technology can be extremely helpful, right? Alerting us, getting us to prepare, getting us to put our effort onto these dangerous moments. That I think would be good.
One thing just to add on to that, I think the challenge is that those sort of extreme events are also emotionally unpleasant, and we want to make good decisions in these moments that are stressful and anxiety inducing. And so technology can also be paired really nicely with behavioral science to sort of reduce the unpleasantness so that we're not sort of putting our head in the sand or operating on anxiety, but instead, making a slightly more rational choice in that moment. So it's also sort of our job as, solution designers to think about what's that experience when you do get a diagnosis or you did gain weight, and how do we sort of help you get back to your average equilibrium and act in your own self-interest when everything might feel really terrible right now.
I'll add a thought or two on top of the other comments. It may sound contrarian, and I don't mean to be blasphemous because I'm a tech-enabled person, but I think we lean a lot on the person to make change, to make decisions about making change, and now we're leaning a lot on tech. And I think those are all both great, but I would say there's a third and an okay third addition, which is another human to help them. And the model that we've built at Able2 is really a combination of all of that. You need to enable the patient to make their own change, use technology to support that. But the reality is some people still need a translator, they need a mediator, they need someone to help them take data, translate it into insights, translate those insights into actionable change in their lives. And sometimes that's really hard as a human to do that. And then the last point I'll make is that's really hard under the best of circumstances, as Dan and Julia and the group have noted. Layer on illness, layer on physical illness, layer on mental health challenges. Boy, does irrationality become like, exponential irrationality. And the challenge of taking data and turning it into meaningful behavior changes even harder, and thinking about people in the different contexts within which they live is necessary as we think about tactics to help them change behavior.
Yeah. I should also say thank you, because I realize it's now almost 8 p.m. in Israel, and I didn't eat today. So while we were talking, I ordered some food, but because we were talking about health, I ordered salad. So I already there's some tangible benefit for this meeting.
Amazing. No, this is all terrific. I mean, clearly there are challenges ahead for us, but I love the lens that everybody's putting this through. So that maybe, Rena, I'm going to ask you this question, and to pivot, obviously being very solution oriented. So some predictions you have for the group in the next 3 to 5 years when it comes to the digitalization of healthcare and how we can apply behavioral economics, behavioral sciences to kind of institute some of these changes. And we'll start with Rena, but if Julie and Dan, please weigh in as well with your predictions. Sure,
happy to start. You got a hint of where I think we're going from my last comment, which is I think we went heavy digital. We were people predominantly in healthcare for all these decades and generations, right? The last decade or two has been a heavy tilt to digital predominantly. And I think we land up somewhere in between. And I think the challenge that we're facing, at least in mental health, and frankly, I think across all of digital health, is just what our partners are calling point solution fatigue, which is just, it's chaos. In mental health, it's chaos. When we started, we were trying to convince people to pay attention to mental health. Now, there's billions of dollars in investment and thousands of point solutions. And so I think one of the challenges that patients, providers, payers are facing is, what do we pick? And how do we help the patient actually get directed to the best solution that meets their needs clinically, to which they're most likely to engage, to which they're most likely to adhere, to ultimately achieve an outcome which we seek for them, which is better health, and for the healthcare system, optimally lower total cost of care. So I think the challenge we face is this navigation challenge, and probably what we'll see is consolidation. Super boring term, but I think that's probably where we'll end up, which is we've got to start to pick the best solutions and put them together in a set, and then be smart to point people to the right solution that's the best approach for them to achieve the goals they're seeking.
Yeah, I would like to echo that. That there's a question of what is the right thing to do in general, and then what's the right thing to do that a person would actually do it. So if we think about chemotherapy, you could say, what's the right way of doing chemotherapy, but then you can say, which one of those would people not show up for? In the same way that, there's some diets that people would not accept. So how do we manage what we know is the best, what people are willing to accept, and how do we also understand this over time? Because we have to understand things like adaptation, habit formation, and so on. So it needs to be an ongoing journey between what is ideal and what is possible, and continue navigate this.
And I think the way that we get there is if we can think in terms of the ecosystem that we want to build rather than just the single one-off solution. And to me, that's really the big opportunity for behavioral science, is to think about what are all of the different touch points that someone will have in life, and how do each touch point influence their health decisions every single day. And then what are all the levers that we have for each of those touch points, so that we're really creating like an entire life experience rather than just a mobile app or just one display of data, and really thinking much bigger, but taking the same behavioral tools sort of in that entire life journey.
Yeah, there's definitely some themes, for meeting people where they are, integrating in their lives, which are kind of obvious points, but it's amazing to see how those pieces can eventually kind of come together to drive that level of behavior change. We're right up against it time-wise, and for those folks who have posed questions, I do want to let you know, because the Q&A is kind of hopping a little bit. We will address them. This was a jam-packed hour, but we will send you a note and provide some responses to that coming out of today. But Dan, I'm going to give you the quick last word here before I turn it back to Ada on just your perspective on what we've discussed today and what you take away from it.
So, there's lots of things to figure out, and I think we're starting to understand how little control we all have on our lives, and what do we need to improve. And I think that the case of mental health is probably the most extreme one, where if you think about the world we've built around us, it's an amazing world that takes care of our physical needs. We have chairs and lights and air conditioning, and we have all kinds of things that take our physical imperfection and help us behave better. What about the mental world? So, what are we willing to assume about our decision-making skills when we're healthy and when we're not? And what are we willing to do in this world? So in the physical world, we build cars and we say, oh, people drive too fast, so let's put the seat belts and anti-lock brake. We work really, really hard around human imperfection and bad decisions. But when it comes to our mental life, taking care of your health, figuring out your financial savings and so on, we all of a sudden assume that people are just perfectly capable. And I think we need to, as a start, realize that we're just as limited mentally as we are physically. And we need the help of these tools. And then we ask the question of what's the car for the mind? Like if you think about our ability to take care of our health, what is the crutches, the lights, the microphones, the air condition that would help us? And we also have to realize that a lot of the things that we have right now are not really helping us. They are designed not for us, they're designed for different kind of people. Maybe they're designed for statisticians. But if we started designing things with a better view of humanity, of our capability, we would have a much better start.
Makes total sense. And it's an important area. We kick this all off by saying, how can we achieve the real promise of the digitalization of health? And these are big areas that our panelists are pointing out. I mean, hot off the presses, came in from Rock Health, almost $15 billion invested in the first half of this year in digital health in general. So to maximize that return on health and return on investment, how do, these lessons that our panelists are talking about are so critical. So I'm going to turn it to Ada to kind of close this out here. But again, just a very, wonderful panel discussion. And thank you to all of our panelists.
Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, John, for facilitating such a great panel discussion. In the closing remarks, I like to provide a very quick summary of the key highlights that we've all discussed. That we talked about the fact that data collection is generally a good thing, but the reality is that people, nevertheless, in the face of data, they still quit using whatever it is that we're hoping that they use. So knowing what data means is better, but critically, feedback and interpretation are very important. We talked about a framework for applying behavioral economics to solve challenges with digitalization in healthcare. Looking at research, why do people act in the way that they do? How do people behave normally? And recognizing how hard it really is for people to use the data. And secondly, developing strategies and solutions, changing the environment in which people must act. And lastly, impact evaluation, producing actionable change. So with that, with the last 10 seconds, we have a couple of questions for you all as attendees. What challenges are you facing? What behavior do you want to change? What psychological barriers do you think get in the way? And what hypotheses do you have about how to solve? We'd love for you to share your thoughts with us. How would you like to transform health? Please reach out to Kelly Peters at BEworks.com with your thoughts, and we'd love to hear from you and begin a conversation there. Thank you so much, everybody.